Imagine being buried up to your neck in sand right next to a brand new temple. You're not a victim of an accident or a natural disaster. You're there on purpose, as part of a ritual. This was the fate of some unlucky souls in ancient Egypt, chosen to be sacrificed alive to bless sacred sites, serve the dead, or punish those who broke the rules. We'll explore why Egyptians thought live burials could anchor temples, serve pharaohs in death, or punish traitors. The reasons behind these rituals are even more disturbing than the acts themselves. To really understand them, you have to look at how the Egyptians saw death and the afterlife. In ancient Egypt, the logic behind live burials wasn't just about cruelty, it was about power, protection, and keeping the cosmic order in place. The Egyptians saw life and death as part of the same cycle, with the afterlife acting like a parallel world, the Duat. In this mirror realm, the dead needed more than just food and jewelry for their journey. They wanted all the comforts they'd had in life, including servants, guards, and offerings, to make sure everything ran smoothly. Most of the time, the Egyptians used symbolic stand-ins for these needs. Think about those little ushabti figurines you see in museums. Tiny workers made of clay or wood, meant to spring to life and do chores for their masters in the afterlife. For most people, these were enough. But for the elite, especially pharaohs and high priests, sometimes only the real thing would do. When the stakes were high, like building a new temple or sending a king off to eternity, symbolism got swapped out for something much more literal. Ancient religious texts back this up. For example, the pyramid texts, some of the oldest religious writings, especially those found in the Pyramid of Unas, talk about binding the enemies of the king and casting them underfoot in darkness. At first glance, it sounds poetic, maybe even metaphorical, but when archaeologists dig up skeletons with their hands tied behind their backs, buried under temple floors, it starts to look less like a metaphor and more like a job description. The logic was straightforward. The gods appreciated gifts, and the bigger and more dramatic the offering, the more powerful the blessing. Everyday needs could be handled by a clay figurine, but if you wanted your new temple to last for eternity, you needed to get the gods' attention. That meant something alive, something that could act as a spiritual anchor for the building. It's not just theory. There's a spell in the coffin texts that says, "I have gone down as a falcon. I have come up as a serpent." Some priests took this kind of language seriously. Archaeologists have found bound human remains and animal skeletons buried beneath the corners and thresholds of temples, suggesting that these spells were acted out, not just read aloud. The idea was that the spirit of the victim, human or animal, would become a permanent guardian, forever tied to the spot where they died. And according to some religious texts, the more violent or dramatic the death, the stronger the protection. Skeletons found with choke marks, bindings, or signs of trauma back up the idea that these weren't quick or painless deaths. The suffering was seen as a way to supercharge the spell, making the site even more secure against evil forces or rival gods. Most sacrifices were animals, bulls, birds, maybe the occasional crocodile. But the Egyptians didn't always draw a clear line between symbolic and real. There are records of temple workers reciting spells about burying the enemies of Ra while standing over a pit with actual people in it. Sometimes the enemy was a criminal, a prisoner of war, or even a volunteer from a religious cult who believed that being sacrificed was the highest possible honor. Imagine being told that your death would make you a guardian spirit for all eternity and that the gods themselves would remember your name. It's easy to think of these rituals as pure brutality, but for the people involved, it was all about cosmic balance. The Egyptians believed that every temple, every tomb, every sacred site needed to be protected from chaos and evil. A living sacrifice was the ultimate insurance policy, one that would last for thousands of years, as long as the stones themselves stood. The big question is, how do we know all this? Archaeologists have found the evidence buried right where the Egyptians left it. Skeletons under temple floors, sometimes curled up, sometimes bound, often showing clear signs of a violent end. These aren't just stories from old papyrus scrolls. They're real people, caught in the middle of a belief system that saw their suffering as a source of power. And it's not just the texts or the bones. The layout of these temples, the placement of the burials, and even the objects left with the dead all point to a ritual logic that's hard to ignore. Sometimes the sacrifices were placed at the corners or thresholds of new buildings, key spots where the spiritual world was thought to leak into the physical one. These places needed extra protection, and that meant a more dramatic sacrifice. So, when you hear about skeletons turning up under ancient Egyptian temples, it's not just a creepy detail. It's a window into a world where magic, religion, and architecture all work together, and where the line between symbol and reality was sometimes buried right under your feet. Archaeologists didn't expect to find human bones when they started digging beneath the floors of Egyptian temples, but that's exactly what turned up. These weren't accidental burials or forgotten graves. The remains were placed with intention, tucked under foundations, at doorways, and in the corners of sacred buildings. It wasn't random. This was the practice of foundation sacrifice. Temples built, quite literally, on bones. Let's talk about the Temple of Hathor at Dendera. Workers uncovered skeletons near the main entrance, some still bound at the wrists with rope. These people weren't just killed and tossed aside. They were restrained, sealed beneath heavy stone, and left as permanent fixtures of the building. Luxor tells a similar story. Under the sprawling temple complex, archaeologists found more human remains, again in places that weren't meant for the living. The message was clear. If you wanted a temple to last, you needed more than stone and mortar. You needed blood. Why did the Egyptians do this? Builders saw corners and thresholds as weak spots, places where evil or chaos might slip in. A living sacrifice was supposed to act as a supernatural lock, tying the building to the gods and keeping danger out. Picture it as spiritual cement, only instead of lime or sand, you're packing in a person. Some skeletons show positions that suggest slow suffocation, with bodies crammed into tight spaces under slabs or in pits. The pain and fear were thought to make the ritual stronger, the protection more powerful. These rituals weren't haphazard. Priests picked the burial spots with care, sometimes using measurements and temple orientation. At Edfu, for example, some scholars propose that the placement of sacrifices may have been timed with celestial events, using the temple's alignment to the stars or solstices as a guide. The idea was that the victims' final moments would sync up with cosmic forces, turning their deaths into a kind of divine power source. It's not just a building, it's a spiritual battery, charged at the exact moment the universe says, go. The evidence isn't all the same, though. At Abydos, skeletons show careful placement in fetal positions, almost like the victims were being tucked in for a long sleep. In contrast, Luxor's remains sometimes show broken bones and trauma, suggesting a much rougher end. The so-called threshold burials near Thebes are especially grim. People crushed under door slabs as the stones were set in place, their last moments spent in darkness and silence as the temple rose above them. Who were these people? Not all of them were nameless prisoners or enemies. Some wore jewelry, had signs of high status, or were found with inscriptions nearby like "Beloved of the God." It makes you wonder, were they honored volunteers, or did they just not realize what joining the gods really meant until it was too late? The truth is probably a mix. Some could have been willing, believing they'd become eternal guardians. Others might have been workers or captives, offered up without much choice. There's still debate about how often this happened. Temples lasted for centuries. Did they only require sacrifices at the start, or did priests add more bodies during repairs and expansions? At Karnak, newer construction layers contain additional bones, hinting that sacrifices may have been repeated, almost like topping up a spiritual bank account to keep the gods happy. Ancient theology gave the practice its stamp of approval. The pyramid texts describe binding chaos beneath Ra's feet, and the coffin texts talk about sealing foes in the earth. These sound poetic, but when you find a bound teenager buried under a temple's northeast corner, the poetry fades fast. You're left with a grim reality. Someone died here not by accident, but on purpose. Some scholars push back, arguing these are simply honored dead given special burials, but the evidence, ropes, trauma, skeletons wedged into places no one would choose, tells a different story. The violence is written right into the bones. Here's what stands out. This wasn't a rare or isolated event. The same patterns show up at multiple sites across centuries. The victims' final moments were almost certainly terrifying, buried alive, pressed under stone, waiting for the air to run out. All to make sure a temple could stand taller in the eyes of the gods. And temples weren't the only places where the living were sacrificed for the dead. If they were volunteers or tricked workers, we may never know, but the bones leave little doubt these rituals were real. Later, Egyptian tombs are packed with those little ushabti figurines, tiny servants meant to handle chores for the dead in the afterlife. But if you look at the earliest royal tombs from the First Dynasty, you don't just find statues, you find rows of real people. Archaeologists like Flinders Petrie, who excavated Abydos, uncovered hundreds of healthy young adults buried in orderly rows around their king's burial chamber. CT scans of these skeletons show signs of suffocation like brain swelling and burst blood vessels, which means these weren't just ceremonial placements, they were people entombed alive to serve their pharaoh beyond death. Take Pharaoh Jer's tomb at Abydos. Excavation records show 338 subsidiary burials, each a person laid out in a small chamber, often with jewelry or personal items. These weren't slaves tossed in as an afterthought. Many were adults in their prime, dressed and arranged with care, which suggests they held a certain status. At el-Ka'ab, another royal burial site, over 200 people were found interred alongside a single king. The scale is staggering. During the mourning period, that's like burying a new person every day just to keep the royal afterlife running smoothly. So how did these funerary servants die? The evidence points to suffocation. CT scans reveal brain hemorrhages and other signs of asphyxiation, not violence. Some chambers had thin walls that let in a little air, but not for long. Imagine waking up in total darkness, realizing the air is getting thin, and knowing that no one is coming to open the door. Some burial shafts have scratch marks near the top, proof that at least a few tried to claw their way out as the last oxygen slipped away. Were these people willing participants? That's a question that still gets debated. Some skeletons are found with amulets or near inscriptions calling them king's friend or beloved of the king. Maybe they thought they'd have a privileged spot in the afterlife, serving their ruler forever. The Book of the Dead talks about followers crossing over with Osiris, which could be a hint at voluntary sacrifice. But let's be real. When the king wants you to follow him into eternity, saying no isn't much of an option. Refusing a god king could mean your whole family gets swept up too. The logistics behind these mass burials are hard to ignore. At Saqqara, for example, burial chambers are accessed by narrow shafts, easy to drop people in, impossible to climb out. Some shafts show signs of collapse, suggesting victims were sealed in while still alive. For high officials like Merka, subsidiary burials were smaller but just as intentional. His tomb held several young women arranged as if serving a meal, their bones untouched by violence, but with no way out once the doors closed. This practice wasn't limited to pharaohs. High-ranking officials often had their own retinues buried nearby, a sign that the expectation to serve didn't end with death. Tomb paintings and inscriptions sometimes show these servants in idealized poses, but the reality was much grimmer. In some cases, children were included among the dead, buried with toys or tools. One grave held a teenager curled around a gaming board as if he'd fallen asleep mid-play, never to wake up. So why did this tradition end? After the Second Dynasty, live burial of retainers disappeared, replaced by ushabti figurines. Official explanations talk about the humanization of religion, the idea that Egyptians became less willing to sacrifice real people for the afterlife. But the story isn't that tidy. A Fifth Dynasty tomb painting shows bound prisoners being marched toward a burial labeled as enemies of order. Even if the mass sacrifices faded, the idea of using the living to serve the dead lingered on in other forms. Egyptian records don't spell out how these people were chosen. There are no lists, no trials, just the remains and a few hints in the texts. Later myths talk about souls who wander the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, forever restless. For those trapped behind stone, that journey started long before anyone recited the final prayers. But sometimes being buried alive wasn't about honor or service at all. In Egypt, there were fates reserved for those who broke the rules, a punishment as final as it was silent. Most people think of ancient Egyptian punishment as something dramatic, public beheadings, impalements, or maybe a quick execution in the town square. But there was a sentence even worse than death: punitive burial. This was the Egyptians' ultimate punishment, reserved for those who shattered the sacred order known as Maat. Instead of a clean end, you got a fate designed to wipe you out completely. not just from the world of the living, but from memory, from family, and from the afterlife itself. The records don't spell out the details, but they leave just enough to piece things together. The Turin Judicial Papyrus, for example, talks about conspirators against Ramses III who were given to the earth. No mention of swords or poison, just that phrase. Archaeologists have found secret mass graves near Thebes, bodies with no wounds, buried outside proper cemeteries, facing away from the Nile. The orientation alone tells you these weren't normal burials. The victims were placed where no priest would ever pray for them and no family could visit. These were live burials meant to erase a person's soul, not just their body. The difference between a typical execution and a punitive burial is all about secrecy and intent. Executions happened in the open with crowds and rituals. Punitive burials took place in silence, far from the city, beyond the walls of the necropolis. There are court records from Deir el-Medina calling this the second death, a punishment that went beyond killing, cutting off any chance at an afterlife. It wasn't just about ending a life, but about making sure the victim's spirit would wander, nameless and hungry, forever. Erasing someone's name was a big part of the process. If you've seen those tombs with the names and faces scratched out, you know the drill. But this went further, stripping away titles, destroying family records, and making sure no offerings would ever reach the dead. In one move, the person lost their identity and any hope of being remembered. In Egyptian belief, losing your name meant starving in the Duat, the underworld. No name, no offerings, no afterlife. Location sealed the deal. Proper burials happened on the west bank of the Nile, where the sun set and the dead were supposed to rest. Punitive burials were shoved to the east or dumped at crossroads outside all sacred boundaries. One mass grave near Thebes held bodies weighted down with stones. No grave goods, no prayers, just a physical barrier to keep the soul trapped. Egyptian spells even mention binding the restless, and some skeletons were literally pinned down to prevent them from ever rising again. Certain crimes got special treatment. The Salt Papyrus tells of a priest buried alive for stealing temple wine. His pit was filled with broken jars, all placed upside down, a clear message about polluting the god's mouth. The skeleton inside was found crouched, hands bound, unable to stretch out before the earth suffocated him. The punishment fit the crime, but it also sent a warning. Don't mess with the gods, or you'll vanish without a trace. Women weren't spared either. The Petrie Museum holds an ostracon, a pottery shard, recording a woman buried with her mouth full of sand for cursing a governor. Archaeologists at Amarna found a female skeleton with sand packed in her mouth and her hands tied behind her back. The symbolism couldn't be clearer. No last words, no prayers, just silence and oblivion. The speed of these burials added another layer of cruelty. Normal funerals took 70 days for mummification. Punitive burials happened immediately, often while the victim still breathed. The Abbot Papyrus mentions a vizier placed in the earth the same hour he was judged. At Memphis, fresh palm fronds in the burial shafts show how quickly these ceremonies were carried out. No time for prayers, just a rush to seal the pit. The Egyptians didn't choose this method by accident. Executions gave you a shot at an afterlife. Punitive burial took away everything: body, name, memory, and any hope of being remembered by the gods. These were live burials designed not just to kill, but to erase, stripping victims of voice, name, even memory. And if you think the language in their tomb texts was just poetic exaggeration, the reality behind these rituals suggests something much darker. Ritual language in ancient Egypt wasn't just dramatic poetry, it was a toolkit for shaping reality. The tombs and temples are packed with spells that sound like threats, promises, and warnings all rolled into one. But when you start matching up the words with what's actually in the ground, things get unsettling fast. Let's start with spell 37 from the coffin texts. I cast my enemies into the fiery pit where they shall be devoured forever. Sounds like a bit of ancient trash talk, right? Except there's a pit near Abydos where archaeologists found burnt human remains mixed with charcoal, and right above it, the exact same spell is painted on the wall. This isn't just a coincidence. The bones show signs of burning while still fleshy, and the ash layer matches the time when the spell was in use. Somebody took that incantation and turned it into an actual ritual. Words written on the wall, bodies in the pit, and a message that was impossible to miss. Or look at the coffin texts and their favorite phrase, "I bind my foes and bury them in the earth." For a long time, people thought that was just metaphor. Then, at Saqqara, a mass grave turned up with bodies in crouch positions, their arms and legs tied with strips of linen. Some even had their own hair used as bindings. The burial pit was sealed with a capstone, and the same spell was found scratched into a pottery shard nearby. It's hard to argue that's just symbolic when you're looking at skeletons still twisted up in knots, buried in a way that matches the words almost line for line. So, were these just rare cases of priests taking things too literally, or was this common practice? Scholars can't agree. Some, like John Assman, argue that Egyptian ritual language was always meant to be symbolic. Spells were about controlling the world through words, not through violence. Others, like Geraldine Pinch, point to the art and archaeology. Temple walls showing bound captives tossed into pits, and matching graves full of the real thing. The evidence doesn't always line up neatly, but it's clear that, at least sometimes, the line between magic and murder was pretty thin. The Egyptians believed that saying something out loud, especially in the right place at the right time, made it real. That's why spells were carved into stone, painted on tomb walls, and recited at every major ritual. But when you find those same words paired with actual bodies, it's impossible not to wonder how often the metaphor became a set of instructions. The spells didn't just threaten, they described exactly what was going to happen. This isn't just about a few overzealous priests either. The practice of matching ritual language with real-world action shows up over and over, from the Old Kingdom to the late period. Sometimes it's a single pit, other times it's an entire temple built on top of a graveyard of bound and buried victims. The spells escalate too. Early texts use phrases like, "May they be buried," leaving some wiggle room. Later ones say, "I bury them," making the ritual a direct command. That shift from wishful thinking to hands-on action says a lot about how seriously the Egyptians took their words. The debate over what's symbolic and what's literal will probably never be settled, but when you put the texts and the bones side by side, you can't ignore the overlap. The rituals weren't always about imagination. Sometimes they were about making sure the gods and everyone else saw that the words had teeth. Whether symbolic or literal, the line between spell and sacrifice was razor thin. It's easy to see why most people prefer the sanitized version of Egypt with its golden treasures and peaceful pharaohs. But the evidence left behind tells a much more complicated story, one that doesn't always fit the postcard image. Modern Egyptology has a blind spot, and it started early. When Flinders Petrie dug up hundreds of bodies clustered around a First Dynasty tomb at Abydos, he labeled them retainer burials and moved on, barely pausing to consider what it meant. Some of those skeletons still had cloth gags jammed in their mouths, but that detail didn't make it into the headlines. Instead, the narrative was set. Ancient Egypt was the land of wise pharaohs and golden treasures, not a civilization that sometimes buried people alive to serve their rulers or gods. A lot of this comes down to the way archaeology developed in Egypt. Early digs happened in the context of colonial rule, and Western scholars had their own reasons for propping up a sanitized version of history. Egypt needed to look civilized, as advanced as Greece or Rome, so anything that hinted at mass sacrifice or ritual violence got swept under the rug. When the tomb of Tutankhamun was discovered in 1922, the world wanted stories about gold masks, not the two infant skeletons tucked away in a side chamber. Those details got lost in the glare of the treasures. There were practical reasons for the blind spot too. Egypt's climate isn't kind to human remains, especially those dumped in shallow pits meant for sacrifice. Unlike the carefully preserved mummies of royal tombs, these bodies often decomposed quickly. When archaeologists stumbled on scattered bones in odd places, like under temple thresholds or mixed in with foundation rubble, they wrote them off as later intrusions, slave burials, or just unusual clusters. At Karnak, workers in the 1930s tossed skeletons from foundation trenches, figuring they didn't fit the image of a proper Egyptian burial. Only when researchers went back through old excavation notes, decades later, did they realize these were intentional sacrifices. Funding pressures didn't help. Teams looking for the next big headline or museum centerpiece weren't eager to report mass graves or evidence of ritual killings. Sponsors wanted statues, jewelry, and colorful wall art, not grim reminders that the ancients could be just as brutal as anyone else. As a result, many human remains found at major sites ended up in museum storage, quietly labeled as attendants or servants with no context. The artifacts made it to the glass cases. The bodies stayed in boxes. Colonial attitudes and modern nationalism both played a role. Western archaeologists wanted to justify their digs by showing off Egypt's sophistication, while Egyptian authorities today understandably prefer to highlight achievements over dark rituals. Nobody wants their history reduced to a story of cruelty. Even interpretations of religious texts got warped by outside biases. Early scholars saw references to ritual killings or child sacrifice and blamed foreign influence, pointing fingers at invaders like the Hyksos. When infant burials turned up at sites like Tel El Daba, they were explained away as Canaanite imports, ignoring the fact that Egyptian texts mentioned similar rites for native gods. The goal was always to keep ancient Egypt's reputation as pure and enlightened. But the evidence is getting harder to ignore. Advances in technology are forcing a reckoning. CT scans of so-called retainer burials at Saqqara and Abydos have revealed clear signs of suffocation, swollen brain tissue, burst blood vessels, and even scratch marks where victims tried to claw their way out. Isotope analysis shows that many of these people weren't even local Egyptians, but likely prisoners of war or foreigners pressed into service. Recent digs at Hierakonpolis uncovered a mass grave with bodies arranged exactly like the bound enemy figurines shown in temple art. When archaeology matches the ancient spells and images so closely, it's time to stop pretending it's all just symbolism. If this surprises you, hit subscribe to uncover more forgotten truths buried beneath Egypt's golden legacy. The story of ancient Egypt isn't just about golden gods, it's about the real people who paid the price for sacred ideas. And sometimes those ideas led to the darkest places imaginable. From temple foundations to pharaohs' tombs to secret punishments, live burials were woven into Egyptian faith. What started as a way to honor gods or protect the dead became a system where being buried alive could mean blessing a temple, serving a king forever, or being erased for breaking the rules. It reminds us that every culture can twist its highest ideals into cruelty. The Egyptians were open about it. They left the evidence in stone and bone. Let me know in the comments which ritual shocked you the most, and if you want more history that doesn't pull punches, hit like and subscribe.